Hey there, scary story fanatics. Welcome back to Cleaving Thought from Bone with your host, Sociopathic. Okay, so not everyone wants to visit a camp where visitors get slaughtered. So, tonight, I bring the slaughter to you. So, run and hide, like it'll do you any good. Tonight, the terror comes searching on its own, leaving Locust Lake.
It was the middle of autumn, and it had been a long summer. The camping season had just ended, and everyone was heading home. Mr. and Mrs. Warren had been camping at an old campground that had just opened back up a year or two prior. It had cheap rates for campsites, and it was probably because of the massacre that had happened a dozen or so years back, but that wasn't exactly something that was advertised. That was a pretty tightly kept secret amongst the camp's owners and the nearby town of Halstead. Kenneth Warren and his wife Margaret had climbed back on board of their state-of-the-art luxury RV after an early morning hike around the lake. They'd been staying at the Western-styled Just a Gosh Darn Camp for about a week or so, and they both had a lot of fun. But all good things have to come to an end, and now the camp was closing down for the winter. The older-aged couple began their trip back south to their home in North Carolina. They had made it a good distance down the road when Margaret decided that she would take a nap, because it was a pretty long trip that they had ahead of them, and she was tired from the morning hike with her husband. And besides, Kenneth was blaring country music up in the front seat, and she didn't much care for it. Margaret made her way back to the end of the large RV where the bedroom was. She opened the door and closed it behind her before rounding the corner to walk around to her side of the bed. She was frozen in place as she looked up from the floor to find that an intruder had snuck into the RV. There stood a brutish man, dressed in ragged and torn black clothes. He wore an old tan coat that had faded with age. It was covered in dirt and grime, with tears that had been mended together with an asymmetrical stitching. His face was covered with a ragged black sack. One of the eye holes had an old, dirty X stitched over it with a tan-colored rope. There were also matching stitches that stretched across the face in an arc to form a mouth with jagged and asymmetrical stitchwork. It was Casper Stoical. His thick arms led down to large and dirty hands that were covered with scars and wrapped with old bandages that were both yellowed with age and stained with a rust color of decades-old blood. Margaret began to scream, but before she could make a peep, those large hands reached up and grabbed a hold of her face. Not that it would have mattered, because her husband would not be able to hear her over the honky-tonk music. Casper dug his thumbs into the woman's eyes as she screamed. Her eyeballs popped, and blood began to pool around Casper's dirty thumbs. The thumbs hooked around inside her skull and were then forced away from each other, splitting the woman's skull down the middle with a sickening crunching sound. Her head was split open like an egg, and the yolk that was her brain then slopped out into a bloody mess on the floor. Casper then turned his attention to the driver. He left the bedroom of the RV and made his way to the front, where Kenneth was listening to some twangy music. Kenneth heard someone approach and thought it was his wife. "Hey, honey, can't sleep? Music's not too loud, is it?" Kenneth Warren asked. But when he got no reply, he turned around to look back into the RV, and this is when Casper struck. Casper grabbed the poor man by the back of his neck and forced his head violently forward, smashing his face against the steering wheel. The force of Kenneth's head hitting the steering wheel was enough to deploy the airbag into his face, but Casper was there to push him downward again, bursting the airbag and shattering the man's face into the steering wheel. But he was still alive. It was the following crash of the RV that put him out of his misery. The RV swerved out of control and fishtailed on the highway before flipping onto its side and crashing head-on into oncoming traffic. Mr. Warren died when he flew through the windshield of the RV and through the windshield of the truck that he had hit head-on. His body was left in a heaping mess on the passenger seat of the truck, next to a terrified and very beat-up truck driver. Casper, however, was thrown clear of the road. He was thrown into the woods beside the highway, and he disappeared into the forest just outside the small town of Halstead. Meanwhile, there was a small group of 5 friends that had gone on a hike up the mountain outside the town. At the top of the mountain was a large rock that stuck out from the mountain face, forming a cliff that overlooked the highway and all of the town of Halstead. This was called Lookout Point. The 5 friends hiked up the trails, through the woods, and towards the mountain summit. Brian was in front, followed by Dave. There was Amy and Kim, and finally, there was Jeremiah, trailing behind them.
"Hey man, keep up,"
Brian said to Jeremiah, who was quite a distance behind the rest of the group.
"Don't worry about me,"
Jeremiah said, out of breath, at about the halfway point up the mountain.
"Come on, Jay,"
Dave then added.
"I'm gonna need a minute."
Jay responded.
"Come on, man, it's not much further."
Brian urged him on, but Jay wasn't having it.
"Nah, man, you guys go ahead, I'll catch up."
Jay told them.
"You sure?"
Brian asked.
"Yeah, I'm sure. I'll catch up."
Jay said as he sat down on a large rock to take a rest.
"All right, see you at the top,"
Dave said.
"See you up there, Jay,"
Amy added. Then the group of them continued on up the trail toward the beautiful view at the top, leaving Jeremiah to take a rest at the halfway point. As Jay sat there, trying to catch his breath, he decided to whittle away at a broken tree branch to pass the time. He pulled his hunting knife out of the sheath at his waist and began to cut away the bark from a piece of wood. The unfortunate soul didn't hear the footsteps approaching him from behind until it was too late. Casper grabbed a hold of the sides of Jeremiah's head and began to lift him up off the rock where he sat. Jay started to stab violently into the arms that were attempting to rip his head from his body, but it seemed as though the piercing blade had no effect on Casper's arms. Casper then grabbed the knife from the boy with one hand and with the other hand held onto Jay's hair, holding the struggling teen in place. Jay began to yell for help, but it didn't last long before the large hunting knife was driven deep into his temple. Jeremiah's eyes rolled back in his head as blood started to leak out from around the blade of the knife. His body began to convulse and spasm as Casper twisted the knife into the teen's skull before Jeremiah fell limp and the knife slipped out of the large hole in his head, followed by his body collapsing onto the ground, face first in the dirt and autumn leaves. The remaining 4 friends had made it to the peak of the mountain, and the 4 of them stood on the rocky cliff, overlooking all of Halstead and the highway below them.
"Wow, you guys weren't kidding. It is beautiful up here,"
Amy said.
"Aren't you glad you came up here?"
Dave asked.
"Oh yeah, that is a beautiful view."
Amy added.
I think I can see your house from up here.
Kim said to Amy as she pointed down into the town.
Yeah, I think you're right. That is my house.
Amy replied. Her house really could be seen from Lookout Point. To be honest, practically all of Halstead could be seen from the top of the mountain.
Shows a different side of Halstead, huh?
Said Brian as he stood at the edge, looking out over the town. Hellstead was the nickname that they had given to the place, because it was like hell. The place was boring, and there was literally nothing to do there besides party, and that was a typical Friday night for this group. They were always having a party, and today was no different. Brian pulled a few beers out of his backpack, which was followed by a few hard iced teas for the ladies. They all began to have a drink in celebration of reaching the top and seeing the beautiful view. But their little party would be short-lived when the sound of a four-wheeler was heard approaching them. The four of them tried to finish off their drinks because they were on private property. The owner of the land usually didn't mind people being up there, but he wasn't too fond of people drinking up there. However, the four of them lucked out. The landowner just drove by them, throwing them a wave as he passed.
Huh.
Brian said with surprise, then pulled his beer out from behind his backpack and continued drinking it down. The landowner continued on down the mountain toward where Jeremiah's lifeless body was laying in the middle of the trail. The middle-aged man slowed his four-wheeler down as he approached the body laying in the middle of his path, but he soon discovered that the teen's corpse had a large hole gouged into the side of his head. The man panicked and drove his quad around the body and began speeding quickly towards his home. He believed the teens at the top of the mountain had killed that boy, and he had to go call 911 to bring the police. However, the man soon came into contact with the true culprit of the ghastly murder, when a large tree branch had swung out in front of him as he was speeding down the trail. The large limb struck the man in the face and knocked him backward off of his four-wheeler. The quad continued down the path, where it eventually crashed into a tree, but the man laid there on the ground, completely paralyzed. He had broken his spine when he was knocked off of the quad, and as he laid there, desperately trying to move, Casper approached him and finished the job by using the same branch that had knocked the man off of his four-wheeler to crush the man's skull. Up at Lookout Point, the teens were hanging out and having a few drinks. It was a fairly nice autumn day, and the friends were having a good time, completely unaware of the dangers that approached them.
Hey, Amy.
Brian said.
The rock goes down about 30 feet, and then there's a pretty cool little cave. It only goes in a few feet, but it's pretty cool down there. You want to go check it out?
He finished. Amy looked over at Kim, who nodded back to her, and then Amy looked up to Brian and agreed.
Okay.
Amy said as she stood up and walked with Brian down the trail to the small cave that sat beneath Lookout Point. Quite a while had passed, and Jeremiah had still not caught up with the rest of the gang.
What do you think is taking Jay so long?
Kim asked as she sat on the edge of the rock.
I don't know. He's probably fine, though. Maybe he got tired and went home. It's only right there.
Dave replied as he pointed down to the edge of the town closest to them.
Yeah, you're probably right,
Kim said, kicking her feet back and forth over the edge of the cliff. A short moment of silence passed between them, like the calm before the storm. It was then that Casper's large, bandaged hand reached down from behind and grabbed hold of Kim's auburn locks of hair. She began to scream as the large man lifted her up off the ground by her scalp. He followed by grabbing a hold of her midsection with the other hand and picked her up over his head, holding her high above him, high above the cliff. Casper then tossed the girl over the edge as she plummeted down, screaming the entire way. Brian and Amy, who were sharing a bit of an intimate moment, were interrupted by the sight and sound of their screaming friend rocketing past them. Kim continued to fall, breaking the branches of trees on her way down, but unfortunately, the trees didn't slow her down at all. Her body fell full force through the windshield of an old sedan that was traveling north on the highway, causing the terrified woman in the vehicle to crash into a Volkswagen, injuring the woman and killing the man in the Volkswagen on impact. Now, there would be police and paramedics cleaning up not one, but 2 car accidents on the highway. In the small cave, Brian and Amy sat terrified. They had just watched their friend fall hundreds of feet to her death. Meanwhile, up on the rock of Lookout Point, Dave had climbed to his feet, and in a rage, he began to attack the brutish man. Dave wasn't a small guy. He was one of the older ones in the group, and he was just about as big as Casper. Dave pushed and punched Casper, trying to knock him off the edge.
Come on, motherfucker!
Dave yelled as he punched the beast in the face several times. Casper took a few punches, but was completely unfazed by Dave's attacks. He then gripped his big, scarred hand around Dave's throat and began pushing him backwards, away from the cliff. Dave gasped and gagged and managed to scream for help.
Help! Brian, help!
Dave yelled before he was silenced by the tightening grip of Casper's hand. Brian and Amy heard Dave's cries for help, and both of them went running to their friend's aid. They made it to the top of the hill just in time to see the side of Dave's head being forced against a tree. A large, masked man was holding the other side of his head, forcing it against the rough bark of the tree. Dave looked up at Brian and Amy. They made eye contact, and Dave began to reach out for them. But it was too late. Dave's eyes popped out of his head, and his skull was crushed into a bloody mess against the tree. Amy screamed in terror at the sight of this monster killing her friend, which caused Casper to look up at the duo with his one-stitched eye and jagged smile.
Shit.
Brian said in shock, before grabbing a hold of Amy and fleeing full speed down the mountain, back toward town. Casper followed after them, but they were able to gain some ground on him. The 2 of them ran down the hill, taking every shortcut they could. Amy screamed again as they came across the bodies of Jeremiah and the landowner. They didn't have time to stop and mourn. They had to make it back to town. They ran down the trails and to the road that led under the highway bridges and back into town. They ran as fast as they could. They ran until their lungs began to burn. They didn't stop until they reached Main Street, and they had never been so happy to see their little town of Hellstead. Right now, it was more like Heavenstead to them. But they couldn't rest. They had to find help, so they ran to the nearest open establishment they could find. Rex's bar was in full party mode. The place was packed, and there was a band playing inside. People were drinking, and smoke lingered in the air as the band rocked out with one of their hit songs, Hardcore Academy. Brian and Amy suddenly burst through the door and completely crashed the party. Many patrons were startled when the 2 of them came crashing in, yelling and screaming about how their friends were killed. The bartender tried to contain the situation and stop the 2 teens from entering the bar. The music then stopped, with an annoyed awe from the crowd.
What in the hell's going on?
An annoyed patron of the bar yelled out, followed by an outroar of bargoers.
A man killed our friends.
Brian managed to blurt out between breaths.
What? Who?
The random bargoer asked.
Up on the mountain. He killed our friends.
Amy added. The 2 of them weren't making much sense, and the people at the bar needed answers, but they wouldn't have to wait long to get them. The door to the bar suddenly swung open, and there in the doorway, nearly blocking all the sunlight from outside, was the large, hulking body of Casper Stoical. Casper grabbed the first person he saw at the end of the bar by the door. He crushed the man's face into the bar. Following that, he grabbed a large glass mug off the bar and smashed it against the face of the nearest person. 4 men that were playing pool then attacked Casper with their pool sticks, breaking the sticks across Casper's side and back. Casper impaled 2 of the men on their own broken pool cues, 1 through the head and 1 through the chest. The 2 remaining men were smashed together with such force it knocked their teeth out. Several other patrons attacked him with beer bottles and bar stools. They were all killed, their bodies impaled, their heads smashed, their bodies broken. People were being thrown across the bar, landing in a heap of broken liquor and whiskey bottles. The band members were the next to go. The guitarist with a frohawk and glasses was the first to attack. He swung his electric guitar at Casper, breaking it off at the neck on impact. Casper grabbed a hold of the broken neck of the guitar and, in one fluid motion, he swung it upwards, piercing right through the chin of the guitarist and on up into his brain. The bass guitarist did the same thing and attacked the brute of the man with his bass guitar. He was hit so hard that he flew against the wall, breaking his ribs. The drummer attempted to defend himself by stabbing Casper with his own drumsticks, but the sticks just poked through the exposed and rotting flesh of Casper's body, allowing a yellowish-colored fluid to ooze out from his wounds. This only enraged him. Casper pulled the drumsticks from his sides and then returned them to their owner by plunging them into his eye sockets, and the man fell forward, dead on his drums. The remaining 2 members of the band, the singer and the rhythm guitarist, attempted to flee. The singer was quickly caught and his face was sent crashing into the antlers of a deer that were mounted on a wall nearby. The remaining member of the band grabbed a bottle of whiskey and smashed it against Casper. Then he retrieved a lighter from his pocket and lit the beast on fire. Casper burst into flames before grabbing the source of the fire. He pulled the guitarist close to him to join him in the flames before tossing him violently over the bar and into the bartender. This started a fire amongst the bodies and broken alcohol bottles behind the bar. Amy screamed as the fire began to rage, and Brian attempted to make his way back to her, but Casper was there to stop him. Brian stopped at about halfway to Amy, and a look of shock crossed his face. His eyes widened, and his mouth dropped. He looked down to see his white shirt turning red, followed by a broken whiskey bottle bursting out through his stomach. Casper had stabbed a broken bottle right through him. The bottle then withdrew from him and brought a large chunk of flesh with it, leaving a hole completely through his body. Brian dropped, and Amy was one of the only living people left in the bar, and she knew that would change if she didn't get out of there. Amy bolted out the door and began to run down Main Street. She intended to run to her house and get out of town with her family. Her house was only a block away, and she knew she could make it. Her feet felt like they were going to fall off by the time she got to her house. She burst through the door and found her house nearly empty. Her parents were not home, and the only people that were there were her 4-year-old little brother Joseph and his babysitter, a young teenage girl by the name of Shiloh. Shiloh had lost her parents and her sisters over a dozen years ago at a small campground north of Halstead. She had been raised by her grandparents, who had sold the camp and moved into town just after the tragedy. Luckily, the poor girl was too young to remember the event that she had witnessed.
"What's going on, Amy?"
Shiloh asked, noting the terror upon her face.
We need to get out of here. Get Joseph and let's go.
Amy yelled. In a panic, Shiloh did what she was told and got the young boy dressed for the weather before the 3 of them ran out the door, not even bothering to close it behind them. The little boy and the young girl were scared. Amy wouldn't tell them what was going on. Amy didn't have time to think of what to do or explain the situation. She knew that the monster would soon be there to find her, and now she had put others in danger, including her little brother. She decided to take them across the bridge that spanned over the river and into the business end of town. As the trio of them crossed the large bridge, the first snow of the year began to fall, creating a small sheet of snow across the ground. The bar was now a raging inferno, and Casper was at the edge of the bridge, just behind them. Amy looked back to see him, and she panicked and began to push Joseph and Shiloh along across the bridge. Shiloh looked back toward where they had come from, and screamed after seeing the hulking man behind them. Both her and Joseph were just as terrified as Amy at the sight of the large man, covered in ash and burned clothing. Amy knew that there would be no escape. She knew that this man, no, this thing, would not stop until everyone in its path was dead, and she couldn't allow him to reach her little brother.
Protect Joseph,
Amy said to Shiloh before she turned back toward the advancing beast.
What are you doing?
Shiloh yelled. Amy then charged Casper and began kicking and clawing at him. She beat him with everything she had to protect her brother and Shiloh. But it wasn't enough. Casper sent the girl's head crashing into the cement barrier between the foot traffic and car traffic sides of the bridge, before he continued his advance toward the young girl and small child. The two of them moved as fast as they could away from the advancing killer. It appeared as though all was lost for the girl and the child. Casper's long strides brought him near feet away from the two of them. Suddenly, Casper was attacked from behind by a strong force. Amy tackled her full weight into Casper's back, and her small frame was enough to send Casper's large body toppling over the side of the bridge and down into the raging waters of the river below. Unfortunately, the beast took Amy along with him, and the two of them sank beneath the brown, raging waters of the river, leaving Shiloh and Joseph behind on the bridge. Amy had saved them, but she had sacrificed herself in the process. She had brought Casper down into the freezing waters of the river. But the story doesn't end there. The river led to a stream, and the stream led to a lake. A lake with a small campground that sat beside it. Just a gosh darn camp at Locust Lake.
Seems you can't keep a good girl down, or take her down with you as the case may be. But we shouldn't expect the story to end there. There are more terrorific times to be had at the lake shore. But until then, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can catch you all again next Saturday.